Hello, and welcome to East Asia's online seminar. I'm Yul Sohn, President of East Asia Institute, EAI. Today's topic is present and future of ROK-U.S. Regional cooperation, perspectives on Quad. This is part of the series, the post-corona world order series. Today's topic, Quad, quadrilateral security dialogue, is a minilateral security network across the region that draws lots of attention to these days, as its role and function have been hotly contested. For example, as a China balancing coordination, coalition versus a functionally oriented one that deals with the challenges ranging from security, non-traditional security issues from economic to the pandemic. Accordingly, and more than ever, the positioning of South Korea vis-a-vis the Quad is hotly contested within the policy circle in this country. As we will discuss today, the Quad actually is still in the making. So the issue for example, South Korea, whether the country enters the Quad or not, must move beyond an immediate cost-benefit analysis of entry, but to be projected in a broader and longer-term perspective, considering the future of Quad, great power rivalry, and South Korea's long-term foreign policy. To discuss this topic today, I'm honored and pleased to be able to host excellent panelists from the United States and Korea. We feature three speakers. Our first speaker is Dr. Ivan Feigenbaum, who is Vice President for Studies at the Carnegie Institute for International Peace. He's also a practitioner senior fellow at the Miller Center of Public Policy at the University of Virginia, with PhD in Chinese politics from Stanford. His career has been spanned, government services, think tank, private sector, and 3 regions of Asia. From 2001 to 2009, he served at the US State Department as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for South Asia, and Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Central Asia, and a member of the policy planning staff with principal responsibility for East Asia and the Pacific. And he was an advisor on China to Deputy Secretary of State Robert Selig. He is the author of 3 books and many monographs, including United States in a New Asia and China's Techno Warriors, as well as numerous articles and essays. So thank you so much for joining us. Our second speaker is Ambassador Sung-Lak Wee, a career diplomat, and I should say that a foremost strategic thinker within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He served in the ministry for 35 years. And most recently, he was the ambassador to Russia. He served as a Director General for the North American Affairs Bureau, Chief Negotiator in the Six Party Talks, and the Special Representative for the Korean Peninsula Peace and Security Affairs. His major publications include the Russia Report and Proposal to Upgrade Korean Diplomacy, a PhD in political science. He is currently a visiting professor at the Korea National Diplomatic Academy. Thank you so much for sharing this time with us. And our third speaker is Professor Jae-Jok Park, a professor at the Graduate School of International and Area Studies at the Hankuk University of Foreign Studies. Dr. Park is a PhD from Australian National University, and he worked as a visiting professor at the Institute of Foreign Affairs and National Security and a research fellow, former research fellow at the Korean Institute for National Unification. He's an active member of EAI with research including US-led alliance network in the region, regional security order, Australian security politics, and US-North Korean relations. Last but not least, Professor Sang-Yun Ma of Catholic University of Korea is moderating today's panel. Dr. Ma served Foreign Ministry as Director General for Policy Planning from 2016 to 19. He was a visiting fellow at Brookings and a public policy scholar at the Woodrow Wilson Center before. And he served as a Dean of International Affairs at the Catholic University of Korea. His main interest of research includes East Asian politics, US foreign policy, diplomatic history, and the history of Cold War. With that, well, before passing the mic to the moderator, let me express my gratitude to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, ROK, for sponsoring this event. Then let me pass the mic to Sang-Yun Ma, who is coming very soon.
Hello, everyone. Good morning and good evening. I'm very much honored to moderate this very important session today. The Quad is kind of a hot potato in foreign policy discussion in Seoul and I think in Washington as well. We have three distinguished panelists to present their views on the Quad and related issues. Without further ado, I will ask Dr. Evan Feigenbaum to present his view. I'll give him about 30 minutes first.
Well, thanks everyone, and good to see everyone in Seoul. Obviously, I miss Korea. I miss all my many friends, but it's good to be with you virtually, and I'm grateful to the East Asia Institute for sponsoring this and for inviting me to join you. Let me just start by telling you what I think the key problem is, not just for the Quad, but for Asian geometry of all kinds. And to put it simply, it's this: too much form, too little function. Or to put that a little differently, the key problem, as I see it, over 2 decades of forming Pan-Asian and Trans-Pacific groups of all kinds, varieties, and sizes, is that the form of the thing, which is to say holding meetings, issuing joint statements, formalizing a process, has tended to predominate. And so the groups that have formed, including, but not limited to the Quad, too often find themselves meeting regularly, but then groping for purpose. And there's an irony in that, because we often hear that Asia, unlike Europe, has too little architecture. But my own view is that the region, in fact, has too much architecture, but mostly of the wrong kind. It's got a lot of variable geometry, but not a geometry that's been especially purposeful and certainly not always effective. Now, the problem, at least analytically, I think, seems pretty simple, that too many groups too often fail to pool the efforts of those with the greatest capacity in a focused and problem-solving endeavor. And so what we've ended up with is a lot of emphasis on what I would call variable geometry, the geometry of bilaterals or trilaterals or quadrilaterals, or sometimes more than quadrilaterals, accompanied by a too easy presumption, including, by the way, here in the United States, that if you just formalize a group and you pull up seats around a table, somehow you will get meaningful solutions to Asia's most pressing problems. But the fact is that, at least in my experience, the reverse has often been true. And so in too many of the pressing crises that we've seen since the 1990s, from the East Timor crisis to the avian influenza epidemic to the Myanmar cyclone, and even frankly in the Asian financial crisis, formalized groups have played either too little or too ineffective, or in some cases, no problem-solving role at all. And so instead, what we end up with is what I would call ad hoc regional coalitions, often assembled by the United States, that have helped to spur collective action. So with that as context, that brings me to the Quad, because as I see it, we now risk with the Quad falling into the same trap. And this is an argument that I've been making in Washington on the American end. Now, that would be ironic because it is not, in fact, how the Quad grouping began. After all, in 2004, 17 years ago, the initial informal Quad, which is to say a Quad with a lowercase letter Q, instead of a formalized capital letter Q, launched a joint response to a very tangible, very definable, functionally specific and urgent crisis, which was the 2004 Indian Ocean earthquake and tsunami. And so that group provided rapid and effective relief to injured and displaced people all around the Indian Ocean rim. But remember that that group had no formal meetings. It did not hold summits. It did not issue joint communiques. It did not have a secretariat. In fact, it celebrated its incredible success. How? By putting itself out of business and disbanding after 9 days. So today, by contrast, when I look at the Quad that's emerging, it is rapidly becoming much more formalized. It's turning into a Quad with, as I said, a capital Q. It holds meetings, it's discussed a variety of joint initiatives, but the group, as I said, has, in my view, too often groped for purpose. And instead of a lowercase q quadrilateral that responds jointly to specific challenges, the four have been united, at least in the last few years, largely by their shared suspicion of the rise of Chinese power in particular, and the fact that they meet and get together to discuss it. So the true test for the Quad, therefore, will be whether the group can work together as what I would call the firm core of an elastic regional architecture. In other words, a group that works jointly and not just alone as a spur to regional collective action on an array of specific and real-world functional challenges by increasing areas of alignment and cohesion with a larger community of potential problem-solving partners. Now, that is not the same thing to my mind as what people are calling Quad Plus. Quad Plus with a capital Q and a capital P, which again, to me, is much more focused on the form than on the function. Rather, if you focus on the function, it means reconceptualizing the Quad as kind of the core of a set of ad hoc coalitions that bring in a changing cast of partners where needed, depending on the issue and depending on who has the capacity and the will to help solve an actual functional problem. Now, there are a lot of problems like that in the Indo-Pacific, and we can talk about that. And the Quad Summit, in my view, made a good start, the one that President Biden convened, by picking out a few of those issues: supply chain resilience, vaccine distribution, climate change, and green technology. And there's a pretty good set of other examples in the region of how mission-focused groupings that begin in an informal, but as I said, function-specific way, then grow over time. The best example of that, I think, is the way that the so-called comprehensive and progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership began. If you remember, it began with another group of four first movers within the larger APEC forum: Brunei, Chile, New Zealand, and Singapore, because they sensed correctly that other countries might have an interest in liberalizing trade, but were not yet ready to move. And so the four, as first movers, became a kind of spur to subsequent regional collective action with others by pushing forward a positive regional agenda, not just a negative one, and then inviting others to subsequently join. So that brings me to my conclusion, and then I'll stop. Now, in the Quad case, what that means is that the issue to me is not so much whether Korea would join, in the sense of joining a standing group, which is the way you framed it, but rather whether and how on specific issues and functions, the four will find the wherewithal and the will to reach out to Korea. And then whether in turn Korea wants to be the driver on specific functions, lending its very considerable capacity and will to the Quad effort on some of those challenges, and sometimes spurring the Quad to action. So illustratively, Those that best implicate the interest and capacity of Korea, I think, are maybe these five. One, supply chain resilience. Two, the governance of cross-border data access and transfers. Three, countering disinformation. Four, sharing public health and biomedical best practices, and sometimes not so best practices. And then fifth, scaling green technologies and diversifying the use of green bonds and other green credit products. So to conclude, the bottom line for me is this: if it's going to endure, which it may not, and if it's going to meaningfully solve problems, which it yet may not, the Quad ultimately needs to figure out how, not just at one summit, but on a sustained basis, to shift its focus from form to function. Because if other countries in Asia, starting with but not limited to Korea, view it as little more than a talk group to discuss the risk posed by China's rise, while occasionally holding joint military exercises, I personally think it's unlikely that anybody else in the region will see the utility 2 to 3 years hence, or view it as a model for their own choices and conduct. So my view is it needs to be, as I said, the firm core of an elastic architecture that is function specific and that looks for areas of alignment and cohesion. And if it does that, that's the best interest, that's the best path in my view for advancing the functional interests of the Quad, but also promoting development in the Indo-Pacific. And that, I think, that's where Korea's opportunity is. And that's frankly where the multilateralism in the region needs to go in time. So why don't I stop there, and I hope that's a basis for you poking at me a little bit. I'll stop.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much for sharing your invaluable thought. I think you're raising questions about the nature of the Quad is very important, and I think we can follow up in the following discussions as well. Okay, now we will move on to Ambassador Sung-Lak Wee. Ambassador Wee?
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Allow me to begin with a broader perspective on the subject before I zoom in on the Quad issue. Korea has taken an ambiguous position amid the US-China competition for a long time, which has led the US and China to try to pull Korea on their side whenever an issue arises. Korea takes sides with the US or China on a case-by-case basis. As a result, the US has grown dissatisfied with its stance of its ally, South Korea. China has raised expectations that it can pull Korea further. The third episode is a graphic example of this phenomenon. Now that the US-China competition is an overall and overwhelming external environment in Asia, it is becoming more and more difficult for Korea to settle on an adequate, ambiguous behavior. The situation requires Korea to settle on a guiding principle for policy options between the US and China. That would prevent Korea from facing intensified push and pull from the US and China. That would also help Korea develop healthy relations with the US as well as China. On top of that, a carefully designed guiding principle would enhance Seoul's bargaining position vis-a-vis Washington over peninsula issues. Now, Seoul is trying to talk the Biden administration into flexibility to restore the US-North Korea dialogue. If Seoul works out a principle on policy direction between the US and China, that could induce goodwill from Washington. Seoul's argument on the North Korea related issue would be more persuasive to Washington's ear. The first thing to keep in mind when Korea tries to set the principle between the US and China is that the US is an ally and China is a partner that falls short of an ally. The next thing to consider is that the United States is much closer to Korea than China in terms of value. The last thing to consider is the geopolitical reality surrounding the peninsula. So adequate stance for Seoul will be one that is closer to Washington, but not too distant from Beijing. Figuratively speaking, if the US tries to pull Korea in the direction of 3 o'clock, and China tries to pull Korea in the direction of 9 o'clock, Korea should choose a policy line closer to the ally, the US, at 1 o'clock or 1:30. It does not necessarily mean that Korea should choose either the US or China, but rather the coordinate and direction of its own. This work will give Korea's policy consistency and predictability, thus stabilizing Seoul's relations with China and the US. That said, let's talk about Quad. Keeping in mind the 1 o'clock or 1:30 direction, I would advise that Korea should remain basically open to emerging multilateral architecture promoted by the United States in the region. Of course, there is a cost of joining Quad, considering the negative stance of the Chinese toward Quad. However, there could be a more cost of being out of Quad. So non-participation in Quad is not an option of Korea. Therefore, it is appropriate for Korea to work with Quad one way or another. It's worth noting that Japan, Australia, and India are all participating in Quad, even though they have different coordinates and positions between the US and China. Because of the differences among the participants, Quad focuses on collective actions in functional and non-security areas. Such an approach seems to be useful to gain wider support and participation. Further, if Quad maintains the current form of the loose forum, the Chinese reaction would be manageable. Having said that, I would suggest Korea could be either a second-tier participant in the format of Quad Plus or work with Quad on a thematic basis. In the initial stage, Korea can work with Quad on economic, health, environmental, humanitarian issues. As to the cost of the Chinese reaction, Korea could manage it by making a constructive role within Quad, so the Quad will not evolve in the extreme direction of an anti-China alliance. In the same vein, Korea has to participate in the emerging economic architecture in the region. It is not a good thing that South Korea did not participate in the TPP. Recently, President Moon Jae-in said Korea should take part in the CPTPP. It is belated, but still a good judgment. However, Korea needs to make its own efforts to prevent such an organization from pursuing excessive anti-China solidarity. Let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Wee. Ambassador Wee talked about the 1 o'clock or 1:30 stance with regard to the Quad and other regional competition issue between Washington and Beijing. I think this is another very important and very interesting point that we can follow up in the later discussion. Our third panelist is Professor Jae-Jok Park. Professor Park, and now floor is yours.
Thanks, Professor Mar, and I'd like to thank EAI for inviting me to this important event. Now, given the time constraint of 8 minutes, I'd like to get down to my presentation without any further ado. As two previous speakers presented, we can't deny that Quad has an element of China containment. Also, I claim that at the same time, Quad is a product of U.S. strategy of linking among U.S.-led alliances and security partnerships. Therefore, if South Korea would not participate in Quad Plus, South Korea would become a second-tier ally within the network, while Japan will remain as a part of its core groups. We all know that Japan has been enhancing security cooperation with some European states like Great Britain and France, as well as other Quad members, US, India, and Australia. On the other hand, if South Korea would participate in the Quad Plus, the current South Korean government is concerned that South Korea would unnecessarily provoke China, as a result of which China might not be cooperating with South Korea on resolving the North Korean nuclear crisis. Therefore, South Korea should work very fine line between participation and making a reservation and participating in the Quad Plus. That said, a good news is that Quad Plus is not singular, but plural, as previous two speakers presented. Since November of 2017, when President Trump announced the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategies, there have been a dozen of official Quad meetings. So at each of the meetings, the Quad states discuss not only freedom of navigation in South China Sea, but also such functional issues as infrastructure building, maritime capacity building, maritime domain awareness, cybersecurity, so on and so forth. Also, Quad Plus does not necessarily mean that all the four Quad states should be involved. 2 or 3 of the Quad states can work with other non-Quad members. Therefore, given the variety of issues and the various combination of participating states, Quad Plus for sure is not singular, but plural. It is wrong to describe Quad Plus as South Korea joining the Quad as fifth members. So in my talking points I submitted to EAS, I listed 9 potential Quad Plus, and I discussed its costs and benefits associated with each of them. The 9 potential Quad Plus are official meetings among high-ranking officers. First, second, infrastructure investment / post-COVID economic reconstruction. Third, maritime capacity building / maritime domain awareness. 4, vaccine export group. 5, climate change. 6, critical and emerging technology. 7, Quad Plus to diversify supply chain. 8, Quad Plus declare universal norms, values, and democracy. 9, Quad Plus to add participants in the existing Quad-related military exercises. So given the time constraint, I would not discuss each of them, but I would like to make 3 points. The first point is that Quad and Quad Plus are just one of the many mechanisms for regional security in this region. China is also engaged in unilateral security cooperation. Example is RIC, Russia, China, Russia, India, and China. Also, China has been exploring the possibility of trilateral or quadrilateral security cooperation among China, Russia, India, Iran, and Pakistan. And also, South Korea has been participating in ASEAN Plus 3, in which China is present, but US is not present. Therefore, South Korea should not feel compelled to shun Quad Plus just because China is not present. The second point I would like to make is that South Korea should publicize South Korea's participation in various Quad Plus. The more, the better. Now, South Korea's good record of participating in Quad Plus would enable South Korea to engage with China in Northeast Asia. So, for example, South Korea and the United States have been coordinating on their investment for infrastructure building in the Indo-Pacific, in the context of finding a nexus between South Korea's New Southern policy and United States Indo-Pacific strategy. Since South Korea has been cooperating with the United States in infrastructure investment, South Korea was able to join China's BRI conditionally. If South Korea had not coordinated with the United States in infrastructure building, and South Korea had joined China's BRI, the United States would have perceived or misperceived that South Korea trying to tilt toward the Chinese strategic orbit. Likewise, in the case of maritime capacity building, if South Korea coordinates with Quad members for maritime capacity building in the region, that will enable South Korea to engage with China in Northeast Asia, even security-wise. South Korea can conduct joint military exercises with China in Northeast Asia under the name of responding to non-traditional security issues. The third point I would like to make is that we should approach the Quad and Quad Plus from the angle of strengthening US-led security network. In that sense, restoring the South Korea, Japan, United States trilateral security cooperation should be considered as South Korea's effort to contributing the US Quad Plus strategies. By strengthening it, South Korea can claim to the United States that South Korea indeed cooperated with the United States with respect to the Quad and the Quad Plus. So given the time constraint, I'll stop here and looking for our discussion.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Park. Professor Park raised an issue of the Quad Plus, and he emphasized that Quad Plus is not a singular one, rather it is a more plural one, and in which there are many rooms for cooperation that South Korea can take part in. Okay, I'd like to thank all of the presenters for sharing their insightful insights with us. And now I'd like to begin addressing some of the questions that our audience raised during the seminar and invite our speakers to respond to them. Our first question to the panelists is the relationship between the issues of Quad and South Korea and United States alliance. How those two are linked, and with regard to that, additional question is how the Quad issue will be featured in the upcoming the summit between President Biden and President Moon Jae-in scheduled in later this month. I think all of the participants may address the questions. Why don't Mr. Feigenbaum start with?
Well, I'm not. So I was going to suggest Sung-Hak take this one. I mean, I think the principal issues for the visit for President Moon are largely bilateral in nature. I think there's a lot of work actually that needs to be done on the alliance, and particularly with the new administration. And it's important to shore up and address some of the issues that have emerged over the last couple of years. So to my mind, that's really where the priority needs to be. And then, of course, the new administration is about to announce the results of its North Korea policy review. And that'll feature heavily in the discussion. I don't think the Quad will be front and center, notwithstanding the attention we're giving to it now. And I don't think the central issues between the US and Korea right now really involve multilateral architecture in the region. I think the priority is and should be on the alliance itself. The United States, frankly, the US we could talk about this later if you'd like, but I think the United States faces a broader set of structural challenges in the region that it's adjusting to. And part of the problem it has now is that it's viewing Asia increasingly through the prism of US-China relations and of its issues with China rather than the other way around. Whereas my former boss, Rich Armitage, used to say, the former Deputy Secretary of State, if you want to get Asia right, if you want to get China right and you're American, you need to get your Asia policy right. But over the last few years, increasingly, the US has made relationships, policies, and initiatives in Asia derivative of its agenda and priorities with China. And I think it would be a mistake to look at the US-Korea bilateral in that context. And so my view is that's really where the hard work has to be on the upcoming visit.
Okay, thank you very much. Ambassador Wee, what do you think about the questions?
Let me put these two questions together and try to answer all together, because these two issues are linked in one way or another. Let me begin with Biden administration's major concern in Asia. Biden administration is trying to rebuild America's leadership in Asia, and the main focus of its policy is on China. In order to lead competition with China in its favor, the United States is trying to build an alliance relationship and refresh alliance relationship. Among them, ROK-U.S. alliance. So in the upcoming summit meeting between President Moon Jae-in and President Joe Biden, the U.S. will try to strengthen bilateral alliance with South Korea. And the ultimate direction beyond this effort is to strengthen its Asia policy, to be more precisely speaking, the China policy. And Quad in American strategic thinking is a part of its Asia policy or China policy. So Quad is, in the American thinking, is related to the ROK-U.S. alliance. And that could be a subject of discussion in the upcoming summit, if not the key agenda items. What I want to say is that the Quad issue will be handled in the upcoming summit by the United States in the context of Asia policy, China policy, and a ROK-U.S. alliance issue. That is why I'm suggesting that Korea has to settle specific directions in the course of U.S.-Chinese competition. If not, that will weaken the Korea's bargaining position with the United States, more specifically in the upcoming ROK-U.S. summit meeting. Thank you.
All right, Professor Park, your turn.
Yes, South Korea's official position has been so far that U.S. has never asked South Korea to join the Quad Plus. Now, I don't think in the upcoming summit meetings between President Biden and President Moon, I don't think the President Biden would ask South Korea to join the Quad Plus. Indeed, Quad Plus is not a formal institution. As Dr. Feigenbaum commented, Quad is in the process of being formalized, but yet Quad is not a formal institution. So that I don't think the U.S. can join South Korea US can ask South Korea to join the Quad Plus. That said, again, I think we should approach the Quad or the Quad Plus with a larger angle of US linking among the US-led alliances and security partners. So very likely that at the upcoming summit meeting, President Biden would ask President Moon Jae-in to restore the relationship between South Korea and Japan, so that strengthening the trilateral security cooperation between Japan and United States and South Korea. So we should understand this as a part of, Quad Plus.
Thank you. Okay, here's our second question from the audience. There's a suggestion that South Korea may take part in cooperation with Quad in the field of non-security cooperation, trying to avoid getting into the security agenda. Do you think this is possible? And in what kind of areas are promising for cooperation and South Korea's participation? I think some of the questions are already addressed by Professor Park, so I would like to ask Professor Park to speak first.
Yeah, there are functional areas South Korea can participate in without a working eggshell around China. So like infrastructure building and maritime capacity building, vaccine, climate change, those are functional areas. And in case of the climate change, President Xi Jinping agreed to participate in the conference organized by the United States. But there are areas between traditional security and non-traditional security issues. I think the case in point is maritime capacity building, because US has been providing not only used ships and airplanes, but also ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assist to regional states. If South Korea joins them in providing them to regional states, China might think that South Korea has been fully cooperating with the United States. But the thing is that South Korea also huge economic interest in contributing to maritime capacity building, because it often leads to South Korea's export arms to regional states. So again, so that there are areas South Korea can participate in without working eggshells around China. And there are areas that South Korea should be cautious. So South Korea should be very selective in this.
All right. So Professor Park suggested there can be a kind of selectivity that South Korea can get into cooperation with Quad. Ambassador Wee, do you agree with him? With the opinion from Professor Park?
Yes, I agree with Professor Park, and further with Mr. Evan Feigenbaum. Both presenters suggested a very useful and nitty-gritty area of non-traditional cooperation. I believe there are many issues for Korea to work with Quad in various forms. Particularly non-security areas are less sensitive and more useful to begin with. The key question here is whether region could work out a collective action platform that can deal with potential problems the region requires to face. In that sense, Quad with non-security area cooperation is a good platform for the countries in the region.
All right. The same question to Mr. Feigenbaum.
Well, I think all three of us are agreeing. I mean, obviously, there's a basis for functional cooperation, and Korea and some of those functions ought to be part of it. And the reason for that, as I said, is very simple. I mean, there's not really a single functional problem in Asia that only those four countries in the Quad can solve working by themselves. Climate change, you need other players in. Counter narcotics, you need other players in. Maritime capacity building, you need other players in. Infrastructure, the operations that matter are addition and multiplication, not subtraction and division. So actually, you want more players in. So I think the rationale is there. I think the problem is twofold. One, even among the Quad, there are areas that ought to be ripe for cooperation, but there actually isn't cohesion even among the four. I'll give you an example. I talked about cross-border data access and transfers. You know, increasingly we're moving toward a digital economy. People in Korea understand that very well. And on issues like data localization, where India increasingly is trying to localize all data, but also on cross-border data access and transfers, even among the Quad countries, there are distinctive models and there's no agreement. You may recall that Prime Minister Abe introduced the so-called Osaka Initiative, which was a cross-border data initiative in the G20 context when Japan was in the G20 chair. Who refused to sign up to it? India refused to sign up to it. And another member of the team Free and Open, Indonesia, also refused to sign up to it. So the first problem is there's insufficient cohesion, even on some of the non-security issues that ought to be promising and that are going to be front and center. The second problem is that there's already an existing architecture in some of these economic areas. You just look at trade. For the next generation, regional trade and investment standards are going to be set by two agreements: the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, the RCEP, and the CPTPP, the Comprehensive and Progressive TPP, that don't include who? It don't include India or the United States in either agreement. So for all the talk about an Indo-Pacific from the United States as the basis of American strategy in the region, in the economic area at least, trade and investment standards are being set through agreements that don't include the largest economy in the Indo, and also don't include the largest economy across the Pacific. So what is it to talk about an Indo-Pacific when both the Indo and the Pacific are out? Really, Asia needs to be really at the center of that conception. So I think that's what I mean in my setup remarks when I talk about form driving function. We need to think functionally about this, and the challenge is first to try to forge cohesion. Second, to pick the players in a way that reflects capacity and will. And third, my view is really to focus on standard setting. In the infrastructure area, for instance, if you're a recipient country, you don't necessarily want just a Chinese package or then a US, Indian, Japanese package. You want multiple packages because, as I said, addition and multiplication are the name of the game. So the issue there, I think, is really to forge common infrastructure standards, standards around finance, standards around environmental provisions, standards around things like environmental impact assessment. So that's the kind of thing that the Quad can do in partnership with other major donors and financiers. And Korea, as Professor Park said, has a major role to play there. So that's the challenge, but that's also where Korea can play. And I think that's why I said a firm core of an elastic architecture provides a good basis for some ad hoc functional cooperation.
Okay, we have 10 minutes left. I think we can deal with one or two questions more. Let me ask a question to Dr. Feigenbaum first and to Dr. Park. What will be the future of the Quad? I think Quad is still in the process of evolution. Well, there are many discussions whether or not Quad is a kind of coalition of countries to mainly contain China or not, or as you just suggested, Quad can be a kind of vehicle for to promote the cooperations among the regional countries. What direction do you think Quad will be taking in the future? And what will be the end state of the Quad in 10 years' time? Dr. Park first.
I'd like to make 2 points on that question. First is, what I call the Quad dilemma is that United States want to maintain it as a China containment. But dilemma is that in order to maintain it in order to retain it as a China containment mechanism, United States should operate it in a way that not to perceived as a China containment. As Dr. Feigenbaum pointed out, is very incohesive unilateral cooperation among the four states. So India and Australia would like to make a Quad to be perceived as a China containment, so that U.S. is going to activate a number of Quad plus based for the cooperation on non-functional issues. That's my first point. The second point is that Quad and Quad plus in 10 years would be just one of, again, many regional unilateral security cooperations. I think Quad and Quad plus have been highlighted out of proportion now. So we should pay, I would say, less attention to Quad or Quad plus, but we should approach this in a larger context of U.S. strengthening U.S.-led unilateral alliances and security partnerships.
All right, thank you very much. Related question to Mr. Feigenbaum. You have suggested that the Quad should be more like an ad hoc coalition among countries rather than being a more formalized platform. Then how can those countries, with an ad hoc nature, can coordinate their directions as a kind of a common entity?
Well, I think you heard me a little bit wrong. I don't mean that the foursome itself will be ad hoc. That's why I called it the firm core of an elastic regional function-specific architecture. So my thought is that the four ought to have some cohesion, but then strive to be first movers, working with other rotating coalitional partners, depending on the function, to actually develop some tangible problem-solving capacity. And I think that goes to your last question that Professor Pak addressed, because I think it's too early to say what it's going to be. I think it's still evolving, and I think American thinking about it is still evolving. If 2 years from now, it's just a group of four that gets together and whines about China, it's not going to amount to much. First of all, because that region doesn't implicate, that agenda doesn't implicate the interests of much of the region. And I'm thinking here particularly about the ASEAN countries, except in specific and distinctive ways. And second, because there's really no basis for collective security with India in the traditional sense of collective security, the kind of NATO sense of collective security. So if you think about it that way, it'll be intrinsically self-limiting. And I think, frankly, the problem the United States has is that it's in danger of becoming what I sometimes call the Hessians of Asia. I don't know if you know who the Hessians were. The Hessians were the German mercenaries that the British used in the American Revolution. They were kind of a security provider. The American role as a security provider in Asia is assured over the long term, because until there's no basis for collective security until China and Japan have a French-German kind of moment. And until that time, the United States is, and as far as I can see, going to continue to be a major security provider for many, many countries in the region. But US leadership and role in the region shouldn't just be premised on a security pillar. It needs an economic pillar too. And the US role as a demand driver compared to 10, 15, 20 years ago is shrinking. US trade investment, it's growing in absolute terms, but it's shrinking in relative terms, which means the US needs to lean on its other traditional economic role, which is as a standard setter. But the US has lost that function. It's withdrawn from the TPP. It's not coming back. And so the US needs to rediscover its role as a standard setting nation. And that's why I said, to the extent that the Quad can play that role and the US can inject a standard setting agenda in that on infrastructure, on investment, on environmental standards, it actually has the potential to reinvigorate its role in the region in ways that I think would be far reaching and enduring and address some of that problem of the mismatch between security and economics in its strategy. But I think it's too early to say how that's going to evolve. And I think the thinking about the Quad is very much inchoate at this point.
All right, thank you very much. Our last question to Ambassador Wee, related to the previous ones, what kind of Korea's national interests can be served by taking, as you just mentioned, 1 o'clock and 1:30 kind of position or stand between China and United States? What kind of concrete national interest of Korea will be served by taking 1 o'clock or 1:30 position or stance?
Right. The reason why I suggested that kind of figurative comparison is that figurative comparison gives us very simple and precise directions. If we took 1 o'clock direction as our policy guideline, the reaction that participation in the Quad is not a good idea cannot be made, because we are leaning slightly toward the ally. In that case, the initial reaction to Quad would be, let's study if there is any area of possible cooperation, or let's study if there is any way for Korea to work with the Quad. Without having that kind of guiding directions, Korea is swayed between China and the United States, depending upon the issues, in a big way. Once again, if I go back to the figurative comparison, we took 10 o'clock direction when we handled the THAAD issue. And then we moved to the 2 o'clock direction, and then back to 11 o'clock, and so on and so forth. That lead us to unhealthy relationship with China and the US, because both sides try to strengthen their pressure to pull Korea to their side. So some kind of guiding principle will help us. Some may argue that other countries like Japan or Australia or India haven't suggested anything like this, but they have their own coherent, consistent policy directions between the US and China. I would counter-argue this way. Japan may take 2 o'clock direction, figuratively, between Beijing and Washington. Australia now somewhere around 2:30, India 12:30. In those countries, there haven't been any such suggestions to go in that direction of 2 o'clock, 2:30, or 12:30, but the national discussion on this particular issue works out the kind of general consensus. But in case of Korea, our process of national discussion over foreign policy and national security is flawed. Our mechanism cannot work out proper, consistent, coherent policy directions. In our mechanism, depending upon the situation, policy choices will be swayed by the strength of pressure from the other capitals, for example, from Beijing or from Washington. So for that matter, we need artificial direction to prevent extreme sway, to prevent inconsistency.
Okay,
that's
thank you very much, Ambassador Wee and Dr. Feigenbaum and Professor Park. We are running out of time now, and I'd like to wrap up now. Thank you for the panelists for sharing their very insightful insights and valuable opinions with us. We truly appreciate your efforts and hoping to host you again in the near future. And before you leave, all the audiences are asked to fill out a brief survey about the seminar. Your feedback will be very helpful to improve our webinar in the future. The survey can be found in the public poll option below. Thank you all for joining us today, and we look forward to other EAI online seminars in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Moderator and participants.
Thanks very much. Good to be with you.
끝났죠?